Welcome. My name is Molly Montgomery, and I will be moderating this morning's panel entitled Do Not Trade Your Principles, Kleptocracy and Money Laundering. 3 years ago, the Panama Papers revealed to the world the staggering scale of offshore financial flows, but we're still struggling to grasp, let alone address, the instrumentalization of the global financial system for illicit purposes by kleptocrats, terrorists, and common criminals alike. For the next 90 minutes, we'll take a deep dive into the world of dark money. We'll find out how bad actors take advantage of our institutions to clean their money and their images, how we're complicit, and what we should do about it. We have a terrific group of panelists, whom I'll introduce to you briefly now. Their full bios are available on the website, so please do take a look there as well. Anders Oslund, to my right, is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's a leading expert on economic policy in Eastern Europe and has served as an advisor to several countries in the region on economic issues. Marshall Billingsley is Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, responsible for the Department's Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. He's also an expert on beneficial ownership and third-party transaction risk from his time in the private sector, topics I hope we'll discuss today. Oliver Burrow is an award-winning journalist and author. His latest book is Moneyland, which he calls the story of how the world's super rich have broken free of democratic control and formed their own nomadic global community. And Ardo Hansen is governor of the Bank of Estonia and a member of the governing council of the European Central Bank. He previously spent more than a decade at the World Bank, working primarily on Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. So we'll start with some brief opening comments from each of our panelists, after which I'll moderate a discussion, and then we'll take, hopefully, a lot of your questions. Oliver, since you literally wrote the book on this topic, I hope you'll set the scene for us.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm really glad that we're discussing this issue at a security conference. I think for a long time the issue of sort of grand corruption has been primarily confined to sort of human rights organizations, Transparency International, Global Witness, and so on, and it is really pleasing to see that it is finally capturing the attention of the security-focused people. It is clearly a security issue. For every human rights-related story that comes out of kleptocracy, we have a security-related one. There's a couple of examples I picked out. Shell companies which were used to steal $18 million sent to Russia to help it upgrade its nuclear infrastructure. That is clearly a security issue if its nuclear infrastructure remains vulnerable because the money has been stolen. Or shell companies which were used to hide the identities and the profits of traffickers in nuclear material between two different ex-Soviet states. Again, clearly a security issue. It is only good luck that that money didn't fall into the hand of terrorists. The problem in both of these cases, and in fact all cases of kleptocracy, that have been identified is the problem of shell structures, not just shell companies, but all corporate structures, which are able to provide anonymity to the people who are stealing this money, stealing this material, and allow them to spend it with impunity, primarily in the West. We're accustomed to blaming tax havens for providing this anonymity. Obviously, the Panama Papers is the most sort of famous example of this, but it's been going on for a long time. And of course, places like the British Virgin Islands, places like Switzerland, Anguilla, Vanuatu, they have been providing anonymity for decades. However, I think, as of now, that stereotype is misleading. Since the financial crisis, we in the West have got quite good at forcing the tax havens to clean up. We've been forcing them to drive out dirty money. It's not been completely successful, but places like the British Virgin Islands, there are now far fewer companies being created there than there used to be. And so I think what we need to look at is what's actually happening now, not the stereotypes of the past, but what's actually happening now. And I think if we look at the Danske Bank scandal, which of course happened right here in this city, the biggest money laundering scandal probably of all time, 250 times bigger than HSBC's trafficking of money for the South American drug cartels, we can see that the new pattern, the biggest provider, the jurisdiction that provided the most shell companies for account holders at Danske Bank, not just the most in terms of the volume of shell companies used, but the ones that held the biggest amount of money, including apparently for Vladimir Putin's own family, was not one of the traditional tax havens, but was the UK. The UK, whether that was Scottish limited partnerships or limited liability partnerships, was the jurisdiction of choice for the kleptocrats who used Danske Bank. The two examples I mentioned earlier, the money being stolen that was supposed to upgrade nuclear infrastructure, and the trafficking of nuclear material, both of those were American shell companies, Pennsylvania and Delaware, respectively. Not Venezuela, sorry. That would be very different. We know, thanks to the extraordinary work of Jason Sharman and his related group of academics, that the easiest two places in the world now to create companies are the UK and the US. The US is significantly easier, but I think in the UK we're doing our best to catch up. And this isn't just a question of shell companies. There's also trusts. I was a couple of weeks ago in South Dakota looking into their trust industry, which has increased in size from about 50 billion US dollars 8 years ago to almost 300 billion now. That is all the money that used to be in the Bahamas and used to be in Switzerland is now ending up in South Dakota. Just at the end of last year, there was a rush of money coming in from Chinese billionaires who particularly like the fact that South Dakota's tax regime is now much more beneficial to them than that in Hong Kong. That is a worrying thing if money is leaving Hong Kong and going to South Dakota. Interestingly, there is a remarkable parallel between why Danske Bank did nothing about the dirty money going through its accounts and why both the UK and the more business-friendly, I use that in inverted commas, states in the US are doing nothing about the shell company problem, and that is because we say we cannot afford to do anything about it. There was a debate in the British Parliament saying that cracking down on the misuse of UK shell companies would cost the British economy hundreds of millions of pounds. It is an astonishingly penny-wise and pound-foolish argument to say that, considering the cost of fraud to the British economy is ranked in the hundreds of billions of pounds. It would be a saving of 1,000 times to save for that investment. It is, I think, important that we recognize that the problem is now not one concentrated in sunny places for shady people like Panama and the British Virgin Islands. The problem is now concentrated in the major onshore economies, the UK and the US. Briefly, I'm going to say we are going to be focusing here a lot on Russian money, inevitably because of where we are and because of everyone likes talking about Putin. Putin likes it when we talk about Putin. I would say Russian money is a known unknown. The threat that Russian money poses to us is a known unknown. I think it's very important that we keep our eye, however, on Chinese money. It is the great unknown unknown. In terms of the amount of money that is moving out of China, it absolutely dwarfs the amount of money that is moving out of Russia. I have a friend who is a contact who is a small-scale Russian oligarch. Obviously this is a slight category of, well, he would say this, wouldn't he? But he said to me, I don't understand why you always talk about the Russians. Look what we spend our money on. We spend it on yachts and football clubs. We don't even know what the Chinese spend their money on. I think this is something that we all need to bear in mind. The two lessons I would like everyone to take away from this is, one, that the problem is not anymore in faraway places, it is right here. And the Chinese are far more of a problem than the Russians. Thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Oliver. Now I would like to turn to Anders, since your work in Russia and Ukraine has given you a lot of insight into the flows of dark and often dirty money to the West, and I know you have some ideas about what we should be doing to stop it.
Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you very much to the Lennart Meri conference. It's lovely to be here again. I think that this is really an extra venue. My fundamental thesis is that we need to focus on Russia as an authoritarian kleptocracy and not have any illusions about what Putin and his people are up to. I've just published a book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, the path from market economy to kleptocracy, where I'm assessing how large these money flows are from Russia. Not saying that China is, not saying that anything about China is more important, but we are just by Russia here, and we need to focus upon it. Putin has always praised the KGB. That's what he really likes. And in the early 90s, he was deeply involved in organized crime in St. Petersburg, which was then the most criminal place in Russia. And he has continued with this. So in the early 90s, he established this apparatus with two brothers, Rotenberg, Yuri Kovalchuk, and Gennady Timchenko, and this has become a big money-making machine. It really took off in 2004, in Putin's second term, when Putin got full control, not only of a state, but also the second circle, the state corporations, and the third circle has been these cronies. In a pioneering work from 2008, Boris Nemtsov and Vladimir Milov assessed how much money these people took out of Gazprom. And the number was astounding, but also credible. $60 billion in 4 years, $15 billion a year. And this money-making machine has continued. So Putin's ATM is Gazprom. That's how it should be looked upon. It's not a commercial enterprise. It's first of all a machine of corruption, secondly a geopolitical instrument. And I think this is how the West should turn around. So my assessment is that this has continued. $10–15 billion a year from Gazprom alone, and then about as much for the Putin cronies from other state companies and the state. How is it done? The big thing is state procurement. Why is Gazprom building so many pipelines? Because they are built by Timchenko and the brothers Rotenberg at no-bid contracts, that we are making massive amounts of money. These people have monopoly on a large share of the state procurement in Russia. And we can see this on what has happened to the market capitalization of Gazprom. In May 2008, when investors still believed that Putin was serious about improving corporate governance in Russia, Gazprom's market value in London peaked at $369 billion. Today, it's slightly less than $60 billion. So it has fallen by $310 billion. Why? Because Gazprom doesn't work for shareholders, including the Russian state. It works for Timchenko, Rotenbergs, Kovalchuk, and Putin himself. So this is $310 billion that we have burnt. Why? For their benefit. And what is the consequence for the CEO of Gazprom? Alexei Miller has been sitting there since May 2001. So this is clearly what Putin wants to accomplish in Gazprom. So what is happening with this outflow? Well, I would say that the outflow has been in this order of $15 to $25 billion for Putin and his closest cronies since around 2006, when they had the whole machine going. It goes out, and you wonder, why would they take it abroad? Because Russia has no property rights. So what do you do when you don't have property rights? You put it in the bank, and the bank is abroad. So the money goes out, typically not through the Baltics, but through Cyprus, British Virgin Island, Cayman Island. Cayman Island is the second biggest investor in US securities, according to US Treasury, with a bit more than $1.7 trillion in US securities. Less than Japan, but more than China. So this is enormous amounts of money, and it's perfectly anonymous. Nobody, not even US Treasury, knows who this money actually belongs to. And why do they need so much money? Because money is power, and power is money. If they would lose power, then they need the money in order to take it back. And this is also why you can see that the big oligarchs are competing so much about having the biggest yacht. If you don't have the biggest yacht, you're nobody. So this is what the competition is about. And as Oliver so well already pointed out, the money then goes to Wilmington, Delaware, and to London. These are the biggest, Wilmington, Delaware is the biggest company creator in the world. And creating anonymous LLCs, and then we don't know, another branch goes into real estate. Real estate was initially in the Patriot Act of 2001, But then it turned out to be too troublesome for the real estate sector, read Donald Trump, to handle all of this money laundering controls. So real estate sector was temporarily exempted, which it still is. And the Secretary of Treasury could, with a stroke of a pen, change this. So far, he has found no reason to do so. And this is a large number of different secretaries of Treasury. So the total amount of Russian capital outflow each year is about $40 billion. The accumulated amount is 800 billion or $1 trillion. You have different assessments. This is an enormous power. With a little bit of this money, you can do so many different things. For example, finance the Brexit referendum. So what should be done? I think that there are two cures, and I guess that the next speakers will talk more about it. The first is prohibit anonymous ownership. The European Union adopted last June the fifth anti-money laundering directive, which will force EU countries to do that within a few years. Right now, there is an intense discussion in the House Financial Services Committee about this in the United States. And the second, which I hope that Marshall Billingsley will talk about here, is to clean up money laundering. And here I think that the best authority is the US FinCEN, and that Europe needs to catch up in this regard. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Anders. Ardo, I'd like to go to you for a local perspective next. We've heard a bit from Oliver about the Danske Bank scandal here in Estonia, but the laundromats aren't the only problem. And I'd love it if you could address sort of the dilemmas that you face in covering these challenges.
Okay, thank you, and good morning to everybody. And of course, it's an honor to be here. I think sometimes you can't say it's a pleasure to be here, because I don't think many people like discussing these topics. But I think it's important that it's on the agenda, and we discuss these things very openly. I think I agree that one thing that was said before, money laundering, of course, is a global problem. It's a pan-European problem. Somehow we're all in this together. And the other issue that it's not only the transit point that needs to be the focus, but if you have the money originates from somewhere, these illicit funds are being generated, and they're going to, the laws of physics say they have to find an outlet somewhere. They will probably sometimes transit through some places and then finally end up on the street somewhere in another place, presumably with roughly the same owners actually at both ends of the transaction. So I think this holistic view is important. If you think about the challenges facing authorities dealing with these issues, I like to think of it as a kind of three-dimensional issue, or almost like a triangle. The first dimension is the facts on the ground. What's happening? How are the risks evolving? How big are they? What do they look like? And I think in every country, it's for countries, financial systems, individual banks, and so on, have to be aware of what's happening around them. The second is then both domestic and international norms and values, and the choices we make regarding these values concerning illicit activity. Finally, that gets codified in legislation here, either at the European level or at the country level. And it's typically based on, I think an important document was the 2012 FATF recommendations, which was kind of a best practice, a compendium of best practice by the specialists, saying here's how we should globally approach this problem. And then eventually it gets codified into legislation. And I think if there are competing value systems in different jurisdictions, each country is forced to make a choice. Are you with the good guys, or are you with the bad guys? And are you ambivalent, or are you kind of unanimous or 100% on board, or are you kind of pulled in different directions? I think for public sector institutions, it's pretty clear. I think this country has always said we're in one clear club, but private sector players are very heterogeneous. Some of them will say these markets that towards the east are, of course, wonderful opportunities, lots of money to be made, so on. Others will be more wary, and so it's a mixed bag as far as the private sector is concerned, and always finding then this balance between having the de-risking and then not kind of totally strangling the economy. The third dimension is then the quality and commitment and resourcing of institutions to implement these norms. And the central bank, in our case, doesn't have a jurisdiction in these matters, but I like to think of it as a kind of two-level problem. One is about the supervisors, and the other is about the whole, basically, financial intelligence units / law enforcement agencies. And I think over time, actually probably 10 or 15 years ago, it was more of a law enforcement problem, and I think now the kind of supervisory role has become more prominent over time. And maybe we can think of the supervisors kind of like, if we think of a traffic situation, kind of like the Department of Motor Vehicles. They vet the persons, you go get a driver's license, you pass a test, do you know how to drive? And then you have your car. Is your car going to be in technical shape so you get get it registered? And then you go periodically, get these checks. You're vetted as good as well as we can tell. You're okay and good to go, and then you're out there. And then the other one is the police that then check if you actually are speeding, doing drunk driving, and so on. They're very different functions, and the supervisors are not the police, and the police are not the supervisors. Both of them have to play an important role. So there's three elements: the environment, norms and values, and then institutions. And I think when you're in a stable period where not much changes, then these things can kind of converge to a nice equilibrium where you understand the risks, you've set up the systems that are commensurate with those risks, and institutions do their job, and so on. And you have occasional cases of wrongdoing because you never let the risks down to zero, but it's basically an acceptable situation. I think the problem is that the world has changed a lot. I'm not sure if there's more criminal money, but certainly there's more. These issues of sanctions, terrorist financing are issues that are much more prominent, and we've been discussing these in these Lennart Meri conferences for many years. So there are probably greater risks. So in parallel, I think then the good guys at least have to start raising their game. You take these issues much more seriously. Practices that might have been accepted 10 or 12 years ago are no longer accepted. And I think if you go back and actually read annual reports of some of these banks, 2008, 2009, you will see how they talk about Russia, Ukraine as a wonderful opportunity. This is the place we have to be. We're going in there. And presumably in an annual report, you don't talk about things you actually wanted to make that point. That was something you were actually rather proud to talk about. And of course, over time, these things change. And so we have to revise the laws and so on. I think the problem is that laws don't change overnight. And this same FATF recommendation in 2012, it was only transposed into an EU directive 3.5 years later, and then countries are given 2 years to put that into national legislation. So from the moment the practitioners established the best practice, it took 5.5 years before you had the laws that were kind of in line with that. And then staffing up, getting resources is also something that takes time. So if you're in a fast-moving situation, the authorities are playing catch-up. And maybe one thing we can think about collectively is how we can move in the future a bit faster. Because I think our authorities were on the top of their game. They actually had to take legal risks because the laws were actually old, but they were pushing. And I think at least our financial supervisory authority was the one that closed down the Danske Bank business there already in 2015, has now told the bank to leave. It was one that closed down another Ukrainian bank or Ukrainian-owned bank that was problematic, and actually there was a lot of discussions to try to encourage the other authorities to come along. And the third was we had a kind of not a branch, but partially owned by a Bank of Moscow bank that was sold then to local, basically cooperative in Estonia. So actually there are clear cases where our financial supervisors have really, I think, been much more proactive than in many other jurisdictions. But still, despite that, problems could arise. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And finally, Marshall, give us your view of the problem and how the Trump administration is working to tackle these issues.
Thanks, Molly. And I have to first start by saying thank you to our Estonian hosts for putting this particular topic. I very much echo the sentiment that this topic of kleptocracy and money laundering is absolutely and unquestionably a security issue, both a national security issue for individual nations In the case of Estonia, Latvia, the United States, it's an alliance issue, and it is, in fact, in its worst manifestations, an issue that threatens international peace and stability. So I'll speak to this topic today from the perspective of the individual who sits astride the intersection of all of the bank data, the law enforcement information, the intelligence information, and ultimately the policy setting within the United States. But even more broadly, when Congress established the position I now hold with my team, they entrusted us with the execution of the efforts, or more simply put, in one European article, we are the Treasury's pit bull. So I come at it today and I offer 3 thoughts about the kleptocratic dimension to the security equation. And then I'll talk about 3 areas where I think we as nations need to focus in remediating the problems. I think the first, it should go without saying, but it doesn't, and it needs to be said, which is that the matter of money laundering and kleptocracy is absolutely not just about the developing world. Okay? To be sure, the developing world suffers this in an endemic fashion, whether we're talking about Africa, whether we're talking about Western Hemisphere, Southeast Asia, it doesn't matter. It is a problem in the developing world, to be sure, but it is very much a problem in the developed world and the G20. It manifests itself in different ways, whether you look in Mexico, where there are entire parts of the country that are in effect ungoverned, as CJ&G and the cartels have taken over and have substituted their control for that of the centralized authorities. As we discussed in Russia, we see it manifest itself in many, many ways. I think the textbook case was the expropriation of 3 hotels in Crimea, and then the awarding of those to oligarchs by Putin and various interests in Yalta. Or even more glaring, obvious, and offensive was the laundering of money to the Rotenbergs and others for the Sochi Olympics, just as another example. Ukraine, we understand in Ukraine, the paralysis that has set in with the inability to combat the oligarchs that have stood up there. We also have the issue here in the Baltics, with the money moving through various financial institutions in this region. And of course, the United States, I think is fair to say, the United Kingdom, and many other jurisdictions. The second point I'd like to make is that when unchecked, when we don't combat the kleptocratic spread, the cancer, it not only arrests the progression of society, the progression of economies, the progression of democracy, it actually results in regression. We've seen that clearly in the case of Zimbabwe. Venezuela is a textbook example where corruption reached the point at which the kleptocracy is the economic policy of the nation. By the end of this year, the Venezuelan economy will have collapsed, the GDP will have collapsed by 62% since Maduro took office. Because of the wholesale looting of the state oil company, that, by the way, this was the wealthiest country in Latin America, the largest proven oil reserves in the world, massive amounts of gold, diamonds, other precious metals, a highly educated workforce, among the best human capital in the world. And look at what we face now. 10 million% inflation. If you're a woman and you're going to give birth to a child, your odds are better surviving it in Syria today than they are in Venezuela. There is no power because they looted from the state electrical system. And because there is no power, there is no clean water. And because there is no clean water, we now are seeing the outbreak of diseases that we thought once eradicated from the Western Hemisphere. This is what kleptocracy results in when unchecked, is the emergence of ungoverned zones. That leads me to the final point, which is the massive vulnerability to international peace and security that kleptocracy and the money laundering enablers pose. Obviously, when you look at these different regimes, first and foremost, you see the intersection of various illicit networks. The bad guys, so to speak, find one another. So you find the intersection of weapons traffickers with narcotics traffickers, with human smugglers, and on and on and on. And increasingly, we find the emergence of professional third-party money launderers whose whole book of business is to enable all of these groups. They could care less who they are. whether it is on a relatively small scale, like the Chams exchange in Lebanon, which we recently went after, which was laundering massive, hundreds of millions of dollars per month of money for a series of Colombian cartels, but also moving money for Hezbollah. Or we talk about well-capitalized, highly profitable banks such as ABLV in Latvia, whose entire modus operandi was to launder money. They had no legitimate business other than laundering money for the oligarchs, for the North Koreans, and others. It's also important to say that these kleptocrats become incredibly useful tools for the parastatal and quasi-statal organizations, both within the countries in which they operate. When you look at Maduro and his regime, you see people like Tariq el-Assami, the vice president, who is both a narcotics kingpin, but if the New York Times is to be believed with regard to the dossier they found, also actively moving Hezbollah elements into the country. Or in the case of Russia, the oligarchs that surround Putin, who are instruments of state power, whether they are people like Oleg Deripaska, focused on manipulating our election processes, the Rotenbergs, or others who find oligarchic friends in the Baltics and other places to destabilize NATO, to destabilize national autonomy. These kleptocrats are fundamentally a threat, not just to our economies, but to our democratic way of life and to our ability to provide peace and security to one another. These ungoverned zones, the emergence of these uncontrolled areas become hotbeds for all types of other illicit activity. Terrorist financing was mentioned as a good example. So those three thoughts that I offer as we soon open it up to discussion, but of course all is not lost. To paraphrase one of my favorite political philosophers from the United Kingdom, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. But there are quite a few good people in this fight together. I start first, in terms of the three things we do together, I start first with what was mentioned as the Financial Action Task Force. It is an incredibly interesting, incredibly valuable instrument between the nations. It started with a handful of countries 30 years ago who thought perhaps we could get together to fight drug trafficking and how money laundering occurs in support of drug organizations. 9 countries got together. We're now at 38 nations. We will welcome the 39th in June as we celebrate the formal 30th anniversary of the FATF. And we have progressed that organization from one that was fairly European-centric with the United States, focused on drug trafficking, into a global organization with participation from the major economies across the world that is now not just setting the standards by which nations will be evaluated for the effectiveness of their anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism regimes, but engaging in a peer review process that is uncompromising, is highly technical, is protected from political, to a large extent, from political interference, and which is underpinned by the global financial system, which is to say that our banks follow this very closely, and that the mutual evaluation process, the enforcement mechanism, are the consequences for failing to take action and being graylisted or ultimately blacklisted by the organization. Countries can see an immediate decline in investment, loss of correspondent banking ties, reduction in GDP, lack of foreign direct investment when the FATF singles you out and places you on the gray list. And that instrument of 38 nations and organizations is, I think, one of the shining examples of how like-minded countries and like-minded individuals have bound together to drive the adoption of standards and the adoption of processes necessary to fight this large-scale challenge. Secondly, when there is political will, it's incumbent upon nations that have the ability to build capacity and to support one another. And so if there is the political will, countries like the United States, NATO allies, need to focus on not just ensuring that the laws and regulations are in place, but that individual countries have the capacity to fight back against the money launderers, against the traffickers of various shapes and sizes, against the corruption in their society. But There are times and places where this proves impossible. And so in the case of the United States, with the banking system that we have, it is incumbent upon us to protect our system. And if we reach a point at which we lose confidence that a nation can take upon itself the job of policing, of stopping the money laundering, we will not hesitate to take action, as we showed in the case of ABLV, as we've showed in many, many other cases. In the case of Cyprus with FBMB, the number of banks that we've had to shutter, the number of individuals that we've gone after when we lose confidence in a local jurisdiction is unfortunately too large to count here on this stage. In the coming days, I think you will see the United States pivot and begin to take an additional series of steps. As we reach now and have in fact passed the 1-year mark of the enactment of the global Magnitsky Law, you've seen us use that in a very precise manner, particularly when it comes to human rights abuses. But what we're now examining is where the intersection of, because of course the global Magnitsky Act was created to fight corruption as well as human rights abuses. Where is the intersection of high net worth individuals, the oligarchs, the kleptocrats, in jurisdictions where there is to some extent a political will, and whereby if we target the oligarch, if we target the high net worth individual in that given country and sever them from the international financial system, in so doing we can induce systemic change within the society and within the country. And so we're studying this quite actively. And when the Treasury says we're studying something, what that really means is stay tuned. So I very much again appreciate the chance to speak here at the fora, and I very much look forward to what I'm sure will be a lively discussion.
Great. Well, you heard it here first, so I know I'll be staying tuned. I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure many of you do as well. So we'll just have a brief discussion and then turn to your questions. Oliver, we've talked a lot about the financial sector, but real estate is also a very popular vehicle for money laundering, and the markets in London especially and in New York have seen a lot of growth fueled by overseas buyers, often with no visibility into the ultimate beneficial owners. What steps should governments or even just cities themselves take to tackle this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to bear in mind is that, as a rule, people don't steal money if they can't keep it or if they can't enjoy it. You don't steal money to put it in a hole in the ground. I mean, I'm sure some people do, but most people don't. If you look at, I was talking to the premier of a notorious tax haven in the Caribbean, and he had a bit of a go at me for being British. He said, what are all those Russian oligarchs doing in London? You know, they're not there for the weather. And you know, it is an issue that we need to confront, the ease of securing anonymity with buying London property, the remarkably credulous nature of British estate agents when it comes to not having suspicions about the origin of money. All of these things are things we need to confront. It's not just a British problem. If you look at the single largest source of foreign investment into the Miami, the South Florida property market, according to the Miami Association of Realtors, it's been Venezuela for every year for which they have data. And yet you can't take dollars out of Venezuela legally. So, you know, where is that money coming from? It's pretty clear to see that that's not honest money. All of the onshore jurisdictions have a problem with this. We saw this with the Obiang family in Paris. You see this with the Russian mob in Spain. You know, with Ukrainians in Italy and so on. I think that, you know, this requires, as Marshall was saying, you know, greater cooperation between countries, but also a greater willingness to take on powerful bodies. I think the most egregious example has been the golden visas, which a lot of Western countries have awarded to wealthy foreigners, often Chinese, but in the UK's case with a lot of Russians as well. You know, the US EB5 program, the British Tier 1 investor visa program, the Portuguese golden visa program, and then the notorious Maltese and Cypriot passport by investment programs. You know, this is a direct challenge to any kind of way of confronting kleptocratic cash. This is money that goes directly from kleptocrats straight into state budgets. And you know, so yeah, we have a lot of serious vested interest to confront before we can really say we're tackling this problem.
Well, Oliver, I think, raises a really interesting point. And Ardo, I'd like to turn to you next to talk a little bit about how do you balance the desire for legitimate foreign investment with trying to ensure that it's coming from sources that are legitimate and taking the right safeguards.
No, that's a big challenge, and I think this. Maybe one unfortunate element of these episodes is that somehow we've almost made foreign flows synonymous with suspicious transactions. And you could have two Estonians laundering money without it crossing borders. It doesn't have to be international to be suspicious. If we want to be in an open world, if we want to do trade in a country like this, is actually, we export a lot and import a lot, and by definition, you're going to want to keep those flows going. And if we somehow take a very draconian view and almost try and discourage, it becomes a problem. So, and we actually cite, we used to have 5 years ago, I think that non-resident deposits were 20%, now we say they're down to 8%. I think we said their offshore jurisdictions were, 8% of deposits, now they're down to well below 1%, and we cite that, I think quite rightly, as a sign that we're taking action. But if you take that literally, then you're almost saying, we don't need dollar funding, we don't need any other flows. So we've tried to at least look at the numbers and see if something kind of sticks out. And here we don't see our kind of the volume of our flows as being inordinate, but it is a fine balancing act. And I think if you talk to the local companies now here, the issue is we're completely strangled. We have the amount of and the compliance functions of the banks become very large. The enterprises really, every time they try to move some even fairly small sum of money is a problem. But I think there are ways to be more risk-based in doing a lot of these things and kind of differentiate between in a sense, know your client a bit better. And perhaps by using the new tools and AI and different technologies, it's even possible at the end of the day to have a better regime than if it's all done by humans.
Great. Staying a bit on the region, Marshall, you've been traveling for the last few days, meeting with officials. How do you evaluate the efforts of governments in the Baltics post Danske Bank, post ABLV, post Troika Laundromat to tackle these issues?
It's mixed. There is progress, but as is often the case, the progress tends to occur after the fact, and many of the necessary actions to build capacity to even enact basic pieces of legislation are long overdue. And are not currently present in some cases due to a previous lack of political will. That said, I find here in Estonia that the political will, and by the way in Latvia as well, the political will is very much there. The challenge is to, in the case of Latvia, to enact the necessary legislation, which I've been assured will occur prior to the adjourning of the parliament in late June, and I think we're very pleased with that and optimistic because those legislative changes to strengthen the anti-money laundering regimes in Latvia are crucially needed. Here in Estonia, I think due to a number of issues with which Estonia has grappled, Versa Bank was mentioned or alluded to, I think, and so on. The political will has long been here, and the legislative framework is largely in place. And so now the key is building the capacity. And that is something in all cases with all of our NATO allies we are committed to doing and committed to supporting. If there is a political will, we have the resources, and we will join in the fight.
Great. Well, political will is certainly a phrase we're hearing a lot about. Would welcome thoughts from any of you on, how do we ensure that there is political will? Clearly, this is an issue that's at the intersection, as we've all discussed, of security challenges ranging from terrorism to drug trafficking to the oligarchy that is so corrosive to democratic institutions. So welcome thoughts from many of you on how do we build that, both in places where the laundromats may be, but also in our own societies, in the onshore markets, as Oliver keeps talking about as well.
I think that here journalists like Oliver here and Edward Lucas there and Luke Harding and Ben Judah in Britain have done a great job. We must get it out. And you mentioned the Troika Laundromat, which is OCCRP, that does an enormous job. And Oliver discussed the Panama Papers. We need to have a publicity. It starts with the journalists that they come out and then build a strong political will for it. And I follow rather closely now in the US the discussion in the House Financial Services Committee about new legislation that is being worked on, and it seems to be possible to get it through in a bipartisan fashion in the House. And the interesting thing here is that the big constituency for more openness of ownership is the banks. It's the American Banking Association that has decided that they pay far too much in fines. It was in 2014 that Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan said the big banks in the US have now paid $250 billion in fines since 2008. We can't afford this any longer. The consequence in JP Morgan is that compliance is now second to the CEO, and compliance can stop any transaction. JP Morgan, I think, has set a pattern that the other banks are followed. And the consequence of this is that the US Treasury has put these enormous fines when BNP Paribas was forced to pay $8.9 billion in fines for having violated sanctions. Everybody looked up. The problem in Europe has been that the fines have not been there or ludicrously small. So I suspect that the US Treasury will now give big fines to Danske Bank, whose market capitalization has fallen by 50%, and Swedbank, whose market capitalization has fallen by 40%. And that will change the incentives inside the banks, so that the banks will build up strong compliance departments that will be able to stop a lot of things. And then the banks will drive the political process, so that the fifth anti-money laundering directive that Ardy talks about, that it's really being pushed through and fully implemented, as Marshall had talked about, the importance. So I think that all this can be done, but as particularly Ardy emphasized, it will take time. And we don't have that time. This has to be done fast, because this is an immediate security threat, and I'm talking about Russia, but of course Oliver is right that we should also keep our eyes on China. There are trillions of dollars of anonymous money out there that can be deployed to any political purpose, and we have to stand up to it.
Excellent. Anyone else want to chime in on that question?
No, I think Anders put it exactly right. I find whether I'm in Mogadishu, as I was a few weeks ago, or I'm in Lebanon, or I'm in Latvia or Estonia, that the banking associations are essential to the building of political will for a variety of reasons. But we're talking about individuals who are very tightly connected and very well aware of political discourse at the highest levels in their countries, who are connected in many cases to the elected officials who ultimately represent that political will. And so the buy-in of the banking associations, the support of those associations, and I have to say in the case of both Estonia and Latvia, the banking associations have been absolutely fantastic to work with, likewise in Lebanon and in Somalia. But the other thing that Anders, I just would foot stomp is investigative journalism is of the utmost importance. It doesn't matter if you get every last piece of it exactly right. What matters is that the broad contours are sketched out and exposed for the world to see. So I think that is another essential ingredient. But ultimately, it also comes down to the electorate. It ultimately comes down to making sure that in our societies, we recognize that if we don't check the corruption, it spirals. The informal economies grow. The tax revenues drop. The provision of basic services become more and more difficult. Countries stay away. Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index. Companies will not make investments. Job growth decreases. And people have to realize that ultimately it's in their hands, especially it's in their hands in democracies. But if they don't vote with their conscience, they do risk ultimately seeing that arresting of democratic process that I mentioned, or in the case of many countries, regression.
Well, I think that's all very well said. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to turn to all of you. Edward Lucas has had his hand up for about the last half an hour, so we'll start with you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And you haven't been sufficiently kind about Oliver's book, so I will just say that Moneyland is absolutely brilliant, and please buy it.
Buy Ed's books as well.
But I mean, I hope you're right, Secretary Billingsley, because I don't see people shunning the City of London or Delaware because of their roles in minting these companies. And I don't see people shunning the Anglo-Saxon world because of our ability to have these anonymous, unregistered trusts. But I think that we have to start off with building the political will by giving the public some kind of dividend for doing this. And I think that the principle there is, you could perhaps as a slogan call it no say, no play. That if you don't say who you are, you can't engage in the economy. So the very first step would be to say you can't buy real estate as a shell company. And the second would be to say you can't sell real estate as a shell company. And the third would be to say you can't rent it out. And the fourth would be to say that within a couple of years, if you don't identify who you are, then that real estate goes into escrow and then back to the Treasury. And I think, it's easiest to do it with real estate because it's physical property, but you could do it with other property as well. You could do it with shareholdings, you could even do it with bank account deposits. And in the end, the public sees that there's trillions of dollars which are so dangerously sloshing around both our financial system and our political system. There's a way of putting them back into state coffers. And the beauty of this is once you identify who you are, then the investigative journalists can get to work and life becomes a lot easier. If you don't identify who you are, then you can't sue.
So, wonderful points. On real estate, a couple of key things. Real estate as a store of wealth. There are many different ways that money is laundered through real estate, so we need to be cognizant of that fact. In the United States, this is a well-recognized challenge, but the Venezuelan money that has gone into Miami or into Texas shows itself in a very different way than the Russian money that goes into penthouses in New York or so on and so forth. It's the same in the UK and other places. And so the challenge that we've had is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all way of tackling this problem. We have used geographic targeting orders to force the real estate community to disclose to us the cash transactions, and we've discovered that, in fact, as we initially set out a measure of around 300,000, my office did some statistical analysis based on confiscated properties to discover that that was actually 2 times too high, and that we needed to drop that reporting level down to 150,000 so that we both captured the high net worth oligarchs as well as the narcos who come in and buy grow houses and just trash the property to build out the basement with marijuana plants. What we are looking at is a way to get at both the beneficial owner of the property as well as the origin of funds. But we're endeavoring to do so in a way that isn't massively crippling from a reporting and regulatory obligation standpoint. On real estate, I think it's also very important to recognize that there are, when you don't fight the flow of money into property, the societal consequences can sometimes be really unexpected and enormously damaging. Limassol, Cyprus, is an excellent example, where normal Cypriot citizens cannot afford to live in Limassol because the price of a flat is astronomical given how much money has been sunk there by illicit actors. That makes municipal planning difficult. It makes the provision of basic services impossible to do, and so on and so forth. Panama is another great example. If you drive through Panama City at night, there are skyscraper after skyscraper after skyscraper of unlit apartment buildings. So we really do have to work on this, absolutely. One caveat, beneficial ownership. We've talked a lot about that. Absolutely correct that shell companies, when they serve as front companies, are a major, major problem, as are the trust and corporate service providers, the entities, the law firms that stand them up. However, it would be a grave mistake in the field of money laundering and kleptocracy to overly fixate just on beneficial ownership. That is one area that the FATF has articulated clear standards for, but it is not the only area. And there are, in fact, as the United States has grappled with this issue due to constitutional restrictions in the U.S. over how corporate formation occurs at the state level, and I think you guys are giving Delaware a bit of a bad rap. They've actually progressed, you're right, on some others. But we are working that issue very, very aggressively. I feel quite strongly, given my time in the private sector. You are right, the banks, now that under the Trump administration, we finally forced the CDD rule into effect with the banks. It had stalled under the previous administration. We finally got it done within the first year of our administration. So the banks now are required at the 25% ownership level to determine beneficial ownership. That I think there is a moment in time where we can really drive to get the United States much more closely aligned with the beneficial ownership requirements, the standards that the FATF has laid out. That said, the United States mutual evaluation, because we compensate for that vulnerability through a variety of other legal and regulatory structures, we enjoyed one of, I think actually with the UK, the two strongest mutual evaluations in the world. So it's important to recognize that beneficial ownership of shell companies is key, but it is not the only thing. When I talk about laws and regulations and capacity, it is by no means the only issue at hand, or the only vulnerability at hand.
Great. Women in the third row here, thank you.
Good morning, Ieva Joves from Latvia. I'm actually running for European Parliament. And the reason I'm saying is that because I think it's not only a security issue, that I actually used to think a lot about security issues, such as corruption. It's actually a very eroding issue for society. Now, talking to people don't trust politicians, and a big part of that is corruption. People don't trust anymore anyone fighting corruption. And if you bring some good examples that we've done this or that, they would immediately respond at least with 5 different others, be it US, European, Russians, whichever. So people have this big perception that politicians in general are not dealing with corruption, even if there are single cases. And it's good that we have journalism that addresses it, but I think there is not enough action, at least from people's perspective. But I wanted to ask a question actually about US, and you already partly discussed that. And you spoke about political will. And I think, to me, it's a big question right now. I mean, I think it's a very good job done in Latvia. We clearly have to do a lot to clean up finances. But somehow, the perception starts to become that US political will has so much degraded in people's eyes that they don't believe that action either. I mean, starting with your head of state, in a way, it degrades people understanding whether even those decisions made by US or influenced by US actually are for the right reasons. And I'm wondering how often you see yourself that the way US political leadership is currently perceived by world, whether that actually even helps you to fight the corruption on a political level. Because from people, I hear that as a very big sort of a distorted opinion of what is US judgment and what is that leadership.
Okay.
And a minor point
Thank
I wanted
you.
to add on fighting the finances. as an Estonian president and our families at Stanford, I wanted to ask, we can't open a bank account in the US because of politically exposed persons, and I understand where it comes from, but it also makes us feel very weird as allies. So in a way...
Okay, let's let him answer the questions you posed. Thank you.
Well, I'm not exactly sure I can even agree with the basic premise of the argument. Under this president, the United States Treasury has exercised more of its different legislatively granted authorities than any other administration in the history of the United States. More individual discrete sanctions designations on money laundering outfits, more use of the 311 actions given to FinCEN, which were the actions used against ABLV, more targeting the enactment of the Global Magnitsky Act and the targeting of human rights abusers and corruption, and so on and so on and so forth. If anything, we get criticized for too much political will to employ the economic tools of statecraft. So I just reject the assertion that there's a lack of political will to target corruption whatsoever. I have never had an initiative focused on the corruption front, focused on the money laundering front, rejected in any shape or fashion. And in fact, the pressure on us has been to do more and more and more, which we have a lot of capacity in the United States, but we don't have infinite capacity. So we work it as best we can. I think the actions we took against the Russian oligarchs, we went after oligarchs, and Anders, I'll invite you to give your own thought on that, but we went after oligarchs that the previous governments in the United States had no political will to touch. And we cost Putin and his cronies dearly with our actions in recent days. Moreover, when you talk about the sanctions or the other actions, that's just the visible stuff. What my office does is all the other things you typically don't read about in the press. And I have to say again, with where we are with Latvia and where we are with Estonia, the political will from the leadership in these countries is fantastic. We are making great strides together, and we greatly value the cooperation that we enjoy. Again, things that don't necessarily always make it, hopefully seldom make it onto the front pages of these papers.
Great, thank you. I see a lot of hands, so just a reminder to please keep your questions brief. David Kramer.
Thank you very much, David Kramer from Florida International University in Miami. In fact, the part I live in is called Doral, and it's also called Doralzuela. My question is to Marshall, if I can. But first, let me just say, I think your participation here is an incredibly important reminder to people, including critics of the current president, which includes myself, that having people with great integrity and real smarts is very important. So thank you very much for your service. My question is about the oligarchs in Russia, and specifically Deripaska and the sanctions on Rusal and EN+. And you could make an argument that it forced the divestment from him of those companies, and so it had the desired effect, but the way the divestment was done to family members and others raised a lot of questions. Could you just walk us through the decision to first impose the sanctions, which had a huge impact, and then the decision to keep them on himself personally, but to take them off the companies? Thank you.
Sure. So again, the statecraft that we have been evolving, I say evolving because using the different instruments we have does take, we found there is sometimes a process of trial and error. But I think we saw with the imposition of the sectoral sanctions on Russia under the Obama administration in response to the illegal occupation of Crimea and the invasion, the little green men that continue to run around Ukraine, that we could be far more scalpel-like in the application of fairly hard-hitting sanctions. And that experience and what we learned from it, and what the career folks at the Treasury learned from it in particular, since I was out of office at the time, was highly instructive as we began to consider steps to take against the inner circle of Vladimir Putin with individuals such as Oleg Deripaska. In a bygone era, in the previous administration, people would have looked at Deripaska and said, we can't touch him because the world's aluminum industry is, but touch him we did. He lost $4 billion overnight. And we were able to do that because we understood through experience how we would issue a series of licenses that would mitigate the unanticipated consequences, even if we couldn't exactly foresee that there were holdings or enterprises that we just didn't know about that he had in various countries or various places. The delisting process, and I'm not going to get into the particulars of the arrangement, but the delisting process is yet a further example, because what we were then able to do in forcing him to relinquish control of EN Plus and Rusal was to lock in those losses, to fundamentally deprive him of access. I can't get it, but I can tell you the schema of parking money under your relatives, well, I think we showed very clearly that that ain't going to work when we went after Igor Rotenberg, who was not on the public list of oligarchs that we disseminated, but was very much somebody we had focused on. We sent a very clear message to the Rotenbergs when we did that, and we're not at all under any illusions regarding Deripaska's relatives either.
Anders, I know you want to chime in.
Yeah, but I will actually be quite positive on this. I think what I would emphasize here is trial and error. Of course, it is a trial and error. Rusal was too big to be sanctioned, but it was, as Marshall said, a big blow to Deripaska that it was sanctioned. So, well, gas, Volkswagen is deeply involved in the gas car factory in Nizhny Novgorod. So that was also delisted. I think that we have to accept this. The big thing that happened, I would emphasize two things. One was that the Russian stock market instantly fell by 10% after the 6th of April sanctions by the US Treasury against Russian oligarchs. And the other point was that these were really people close to Putin. So it hit hard. I would have liked to see a couple of other people being sanctioned on top of it. May I mention Roman Abramovich and Alisher Usmanov in particular. But I think that it was quite good to have Deripaska and Suleiman Kerimov, that I thought were the two most important people, and then lots of people who were actually quite close to Putin. And Putin has time and time again complained about the human rights violations that the US sanctions do against his friends. And he actually speaks about this in major appearances. So I don't understand why he speaks about it so openly, while he has imposed himself the counter-sanctions, that is food sanctions on the Russian people. So it really shows that these personal sanctions are relevant to Putin. The other kind of sanctions that are important are the financial sanctions. Well, we should not go into trade sanctions, which the US Treasury has not done. So I think that by and large, the Russia sanctions are quite good in their design. Then we can always discuss a few names here and there and so forth.
But I wanted just to underscore, when we went after Deripaska, we went after him for a variety of reasons. His nefarious behavior is, again, too long to catalog here. But in so doing, we also sent a very clear message to the kleptocrats globally that if we can reach out and touch Deripaska, there is no one that we're afraid of reaching out. You are not, the old too big to fail, you are not too big to sanction.
While we're talking about political will, just a brief shout out for the mayor of Dural municipality, who has personally declared it is no longer open to Venezuelan money. So, you know, even at low levels, I think the Americans are showing the way. I think if we had in the EU kind of sanctions that they've been doing in the US, and the world would be a much better place.
Thanks. Let's go in the front row here, and then the second row here.
Meri Logan, Open Russia. The question on enforcement. I'm glad you mentioned Magnitsky bill, and there has a lot of been done on targeted sanctions, especially in the current administration, so thank you. Bill Browder and his small team of investigators over 10 years since Sergei Magnitsky was killed, done a tremendous investigation of where the $230 million went. They traced the money, and it's an incredible piece of investigation, traced the money to the last, basically the last dollar. There is a lot of people that's been in companies identified and beneficiaries identified behind this fraud. However, only about 5 jurisdictions have agreed to proceed with investigations in that case. There is over 20 countries, including Europe, that refuse to proceed with investigations. And the reason being is that if the crime is perpetrated in Russia, go back to Russia and bring us some kind of legal document that shows that this is the crime. And this is a big, big, big problem. So I would like you to comment on this. And the other comment is sort of the other side of the coin, which is civil society. With the global de-risking in financial markets, it's getting harder and harder and harder to use money and move money, including Russia, but not only Russia, for good purposes. Just one example, we cannot operate in Russia through legal entities, and that's systemic for civil society in Russia. But we can register entities outside of Russia. But when it comes to opening bank accounts, it's almost impossible to do it. Here in Estonia, we tried. We couldn't do it.
I don't know if you guys want to talk about the Magnitsky efforts. I mean, we're actually not one of the jurisdictions that has refused to act, and we in fact engaged in a series of additional Magnitsky-specific actions just 2 days ago, focusing on Russian individuals. The de-risking is a big issue. And within my office, we have a group that spends an enormous amount of time with U.S. banks. We're not in a situation where we can, and would not even dream of trying to tell our banks to do business with one particular interlocutor or another. But we spend an enormous amount of time educating, or at least providing our perspective to banks on different jurisdictions, different actors, and the various things that are underfoot or at play. And we also are very happy to work with banking associations. Good example is the Estonian Banking Association, which we encourage to go to New York, come to Washington, to explain how they operate and how the Estonian authorities have made great progress. I've done the same with certain Lebanese banks and so on and so forth. So from our standpoint, we want the U.S. Financial system well and fully connected to the international system, to ensure that dollar clearing is available, to ensure that U.S. foreign direct investment can continue to flow into countries. It's something I work with central bank governors across the globe on a very regular basis. So you're putting your finger on a key issue. The challenge you face in Russia may be less to do with de-risking and more to do with the fact that Vladimir Putin has criminalized non-governmental organizations generally across the board, because he doesn't like what you do, and he doesn't want you there, and he doesn't want you operating there, and he views the money that you receive from your donors as foreign money that's designed to challenge his autocratic rule.
Ardo, do you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, just this point about the, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not on this law enforcement and side, but I think one of the challenges is precisely this, that the bar is set so high. When you talk about this kind of clear money laundering, you have to go, as far as I understand, you have to say that there was criminal source of that funding and that there was an explicit attempt to somehow hide it, and making those two cases when all of the evidence is in another country whose evidence you either will not get or you might be rather suspicious because they might, they will send you some information, say these are the bad guys. How do you know if they're being sincere or not? So it's very tricky to actually get prosecution sometime, and I think that's where sometimes you have to, I think this was the Al Capone way, they eventually got him on something else, and I think in our case it was when we realized this Danske Bank was a problem. The main thing was one way or another to get this business closed down, which we basically did by the end of 2015, and you use other methods to, so you need results at the end of the day, but maybe getting it in terms of measured actual number of prosecutions is hard. And then if we have this very narrow definition, The next level is something that's called suspicious transactions, which can be vastly different, which can be very subjective, which can come out of either press reports or some consultant reports and so on. And that's also very difficult to orient. Is it 200? Is it 20? Is it 2? The numbers can be very different. But this narrow definition is a very frustrating thing.
We have a new tool in the UK called the unexplained wealth orders, which I think are based on one in Ireland, and the US, I think, non-prosecution-based asset forfeiture, is it? Which is to try and get around this same problem that you've identified, which is that if the evidence of the original crime is in Russia or in other kleptocracy, proving money laundering is almost impossible. We've only had a couple issued so far, but hopefully it will help get some of this money out of the UK property market and so on, because it's a massive problem, and it's not only. Bill Browder has been very vocal about it, but this is widely felt frustration in law enforcement as well of how incredibly hard it is to bring any form of prosecution against these people.
Yeah, let me just add briefly. One needs new laws for it. Of course, the Magnitsky law campaign that Bill Browder drives is very important, but also other laws on illicit enrichment that is being used for anti-corruption purpose. One needs new legal instruments. But I would like to comment on another thing, that most of the post-Soviet countries do not have correspondent banking in dollars. I think it's only 4 countries that have it: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. As you can hear, it's not the legal standards that is determining this, but that they are sufficiently big so that US banks are prepared to take the compliance cost dealing with these countries. This effectively means that the big Russian state banks have monopoly on correspondent banking in dollars for most of the post-Soviet countries. This is very bad. And I don't know how, but I think it would be very good if something could be done about it. Personally, I would like to see VTB and Gazprom Bank being deprived of correspondent banking rights in US dollars. And I think that would complicate life a lot for them, which I would very much welcome.
It would.
You've been waiting a long time, I know, but real quickly, there's an important thing that has been said here, which is the importance of prosecuting money laundering as a crime. Our law enforcement, and this is true across the world, that our law enforcement organizations, our prosecutors, and our judges, they all would much rather focus on other predicate crimes because it's just easier to prosecute. There's a stash of narcotics. There's a weapons cache. There's people that were hidden in a cargo container. Understand, but the phenomena we're now seeing, and this is a rapidly evolving phenomena that is also now increasingly tied to the advent of cryptocurrencies, is we are seeing high net worth individuals and people around them who are professional third-party money launderers. This is what they do. This is their business strategy, and we have to be able to go after them and disrupt them if you're going to ultimately disrupt these larger kleptocratic networks.
Great. So we're going to the second row here, and then let's say the woman in the yellow sweater, and then in the front row.
Thanks very much. Actually, if I could just very briefly say, in response to your last point, I think this is crucial. Sorry, Mark Galeotti. The resource-intensive nature of these kind of investigations you're talking about is still something that I think political leaderships don't really take on board. They want law enforcement to go after these kind of crimes. They're going to have to pay for it. But the general point I was going to make is when we're sort of combating kleptocrats and kleptocracies, we absolutely frame it in 2 forms. One is, it is about protecting our own systems. It is about not trading our principles. But it is also, secondly, about seeking to effect change in other jurisdictions, other societies, and so forth. Now, when one looks at particularly the personal sanctions that are brought against Russians, admirable though they are in terms of dealing with people who deserve to be dealt with, it's very hard to actually say that we can see much of a kind of positive response coming from Moscow in terms of changing its policies. Instead, Moscow has sought to adapt and accepted a lot of costs associated with adapting and finding new strategies. I was in Moscow recently and hearing about how a lot of Russian gangsters, and I'm talking about the honest criminals with the tattoos, not the dishonest ones in the government offices and boardrooms. But they're now increasingly moving their money through China because they've found that other routes are being trickier. And so therefore, I think, what I would love to hear is actually some examples of this kind of campaign being successful in effecting change, not in countries that, as it were, already want to be our friend and already want to be our system, but actually ones that are already sort of on the edge or outside, that are already making a normative challenge. Can we say that this actually does affect change? Or can we at least say, or can we just say, however important it is, that at least it protects us from being polluted by these other values?
Anders.
Mark, I think that the answer here is that this is largely a new phenomenon. It comes very much, Oliver discusses it in the excellent book, Moneyland, but I would argue very much that it comes from the Big Bang liberalization of London City in 1986. And before that, you didn't have much money floating around. So therefore, we have a relatively short period. The 90s was a wonderful period when we all wanted democracy and a market economy in any case. And now we are in a new stage of a bit more than a decade when these kleptocrats have been growing. So the phenomenon is simply too new because the liquidity of money has never been as great as it is today.
This is a sort of political science issue, I suppose, in a way. I mean, what's it? 52% of all Russian household wealth is offshore, which is overwhelmingly owned by the top 1% of Russian society. If by these actions, I mean, obviously it's counterfactual, but if by these actions some of that money is, as Putin says, de-offshorized and brought back into the Russian financial system, then the owners of that money will inevitably, in the long term, become advocates of a rule of law. I mean, admittedly, this is an astonishingly long-term prospect and a slightly unlikely one. But I mean, that was the original idea behind privatization in the Chubais model in the 90s, right? You know, that private property would lead to the rule of law. So I suppose if that's, you know, I'm being a bit, you know, desperately seeking for a silver lining in a very large cloud. But I mean, you know, I suppose in the long term, maybe that's what will happen, you know, and while I'm dreaming, I'd really like a pony.
It's not as gloomy as that. We have empirical evidence that human behavior does change in the face of financial actions against the wealth of individuals, as well as systemic change in time. South Africa is a classic example where sanctions called out apartheid for what it was, and we now live in a different world with South Africa. Most recently, as a concrete example of the change in behavior, is if you look at our individual sanctions actions, at the end of every designation we make clear that a change in behavior can result in the removal of the sanctions, removal of the blocking actions on assets, and so on. Venezuela is an excellent example. We just took the former head of intelligence off of the sanctions because he flipped his support to Juan Guaido, who we recognize as the legitimate president, as the interim president of Venezuela. That's an example. After we took the Russia actions, we might have had quite a few overtures to our embassy and to people in Washington saying, "Are we next? What do we need to do? How do we not have this happen to us?" There are many challenges that Brexit poses. One of the opportunities that Brexit affords is if we can finally have an autonomous sanctions regime executed by the United Kingdom with the United States so that London and New York are in tandem on these matters. One of the great challenges we have with the European Union is its inability to move quickly enough with sanctions measures. When the European Union does, the effect is greatly magnified, and we seek to maintain consensus on the pressure that we are applying to Russian entities with the EU. And we wish we had more progress on things such as Venezuela and others. But this is why, of course, we encourage each individual EU nation to develop their own national sanctions authorities, their own national blocking actions. Estonia has such a law on the books. It might be time to start using that law here.
Thanks. Okay, we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to take 3 questions, please. And then we'll have a final round of answers from the panel. So in the second row here in the yellow sweater, then in the front, and then in the third row here.
My yellow sweater saved my questions. I have two questions. I am a politician from Latvia. My name is Lalita Sigan, and we've always had very good cooperation with Mr. Billingsley. Thank you for pushing us so hard. Two very quick questions to Anders. You were saying that Gazprom is Putin's ATM. How do you explain that the European Union is still going ahead with Nord Stream 2 project? And the second, also a simple question to Mr. Hansen. You are ex officio member of board of the ECB. Why has ECB been so shy in tackling issues of money laundering? Bank supervision is fine, money laundering, very reluctant. Thank you.
Oh, we'll give you a minute to think about those while we take the next two.
Alan Riley, Atlantic Council. My question is really quite straightforward, and it's not about, and a lot of the criticism is about the United States, but I actually think the real criticism is with the European Union. And my question is this, is that the great cooperation really has to be between the EU and the US. But the problem is, because you've got a single market, and you've got free movement of capital, and you've got all the national regulatory authorities, and the EU has no executive powers really to operate itself. There's no DG, Department of Justice, if you like, in Brussels. We are only as good as the weakest link. And the problem is there are always weak links. And it's those weak links which are exploited by money launderers globally. And so really, surely the pressure we have to place is on the Union and on the new Commission and the new Parliament to create a structure which has a significant degree of central integrity, which can work and can operate in cooperation with the United States.
Thank you. And here in the third row.
My name is Zala Olim. I work for the European Union in the Gulf region. Actually, there is DG Justice, and they are mandated to implement the fifth money laundering directive, which was referred to earlier by Anders and Ardo. And I'd just like to ask, the question I have is regarding one of the most remarkable efforts that the Commission had recently to implement that directive, which was publishing a list of 23 questionable jurisdictions, which resulted in a fiasco. It was the first and only time in history that the Commission initiative has been unanimously rejected by the member states. And sitting in Riyadh, I knew very well that the Saudis were upset because they were on the list, but we also understood that the United States was very strongly lobbying against this list from being accepted. Now it's going back to the drawing board, but I'd like the panelists to respond. What is your take on that episode? What does it mean about European capacity, and also what you were mentioning about working in tandem with the US?
Great. So we just have a few minutes left. I'd ask each of our panelists to capture some thoughts on those questions, as well as concluding thoughts. Ardo, maybe I'll start with you.
No, thank you for the question on the role of the ECB. And I think this is, again, since, as I started out, when the world changes, then everybody is changing gradually. The legislation is step by step is being aligned with the new framework. I think if you look at the statutes, right, the ECB has no formal responsibility for money laundering. That's if you think about it as a very narrow sense. It does, however, have the only authority in the euro area to issue licenses and withdraw licenses. So if you want to actually deal with these issues, it has to be the ECB which takes the license away in an area where it formally has no responsibility. Now, if you think about broader, that the central bank does have responsibility in broader governance of the banks, it does have issues related to fit and proper. So it's not black and white, but I think initially there's a kind of, when you go out, and we had this case in Estonia with Versobank, you're going to go and take away the license of a totally solvent bank. I think the bank supervisors have a much easier time when it's their day-to-day business when the bank is bankrupt and you take away the license. There are many more legal risks, I think, associated with taking away licenses for solvent banks. And I think it's just that people are treading carefully initially. I think our case, actually, which was pushed very much by our own FSA to take this case on and do it, was actually one that may set a precedent and actually now embolden steps in the future.
Great. Marshall.
You prompted a thought, which is if your bank is focused on money laundering and you're not solvent, you're probably not very good at it. But Just a thought. I'd like to build off of what you just said and then try to address pieces of these 2 points. The Verso Bank experience, the Norvik Bank experience in Latvia, I think definitely show that there is a question over who has the responsibility for shuttering banks who are primarily of an ongoing money laundering concern. If in fact the ECB does not have that authority, in our view, that means the authority was never granted to the Commission or the EU, and therefore it must reside in the nation. And so the nation should take action and not try to make this another jurisdiction's challenge. In line with that thinking, it's important to stress that the FATF and the general operation of anti-money laundering actions worldwide recognize that first and foremost, the fight against money laundering is a local one, because the money enters at the branch level. The compliance activities have to be strong at the local level, and the regulators, the supervisors, and the enforcement authorities all have to operate at the local level. So while there may be valuable additional roles at the EU level, those should not come at the expense of or exonerate or relieve individual member nations of their obligations to fight money laundering, okay? Some of the proposals that are being made would appear to allow individual nations to avoid the resource-intensive commitments and make that instead a problem to be dealt with at the Brussels level. And that is something we should all reject. The fifth directive had many, many critically important things in it. The Parliament's requirement, and I say to our future parliamentarians, please understand, the requirement to produce a gray list when the Commission itself and a large number of EU members are FATF members, but the Commission is a member of the FATF, right? And if every other European country that isn't a member of the FATF is a member of Moneyval, we have a well-established process for developing gray lists that come out of this whole mutual evaluation thing I was discussing. Nations understand how they're going to be evaluated. Latvia is going through it right now. The big Moneyval evaluation will be this late fall. Estonia is beginning to get ready because in 2 years, Estonia is going to have their next fifth round mutual evaluation, the toughest round by far. Countries understand what they need to do. And while they have a tough discussion, if it's not remediated and they are going to be put on the public notice, the so-called gray list, immediately what happens is a high-level commitment is demanded by the FATF to fix the problems, and then an action plan is developed. And countries understand what that process is and how do you get off the public notice. The Isle of Man is a great example of a country that effectively was gray listed and exited in record time because they actually just got down to it and implemented the necessary changes. Now it's an ongoing effort to ensure that we keep focused, right? The problem with the EC list were really twofold. One is they were substituting their judgment for the FATF in a non-transparent process with no clear entry or exit criteria, with an obligation to not put any EU member nation on such a list, and with very faulty criteria on their face. And I can get into the arcane details. I was just in Brussels because I'm very worried about what I'm now hearing is the next proposed foray into this. But I will say, as the current FATF president, not as in this comment, not as the American, but as the FATF president, it is vital that any future gray list issues for money laundering stick within the globally agreed FATF standards and don't go beyond them, and that we harmonize the FATF list with the Commission's list accordingly.
Anders.
2 quick points on Gazprom. Yes, I consider Gazprom to be an organized crime syndicate, an organization that is there so that Putin's friends can steal $15 billion a year from it, must be considered a criminal organization. Gazprom should not be allowed to bank in decent constituencies. And therefore, I think that Gazprom should simply be excluded know your customer rules should not allow Gazprom, and of course then one should build Nord Stream 2. So I completely agree with you, Lolita. On Alan's point, I would take a different tack than Marshall on this. I think in line with what Nicolas Véran and Joshua Kirschenbaum have argued in a very good policy paper, that it would be better to have an EU institution because money flows so fast between countries. And as both Ardo and Marshall said, now there is a hole in the whole system, and it's better to build it up on an EU level. Finland, I think it has 350 people hired. The Latvian financial regulator has 170 people. So the Finland is the ideal that the EU should adopt and take for the whole. It's the same as we don't have an EU banking union. This needs to be developed. Thank you.
Oliver.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with everything Anders is saying. I mean, the fact that Gazprom is still being integrated into the EU energy architecture is extraordinary. We know what it looks like when governments tackle a problem. You know, when governments tackle road deaths or smoking, you know, they go at it and they succeed. We're losing this fight against kleptocratic cash at the moment as a world because we're not taking it seriously enough. I think along with climate change, it's probably the most urgent issue that civilization faces as a whole. And the reason we're not dealing with it is because it's expensive to deal with it, but it will never be cheaper to deal with than it is at the moment. So I think it is urgent. The quicker we do it, the easier it will be.
Well, that's a great point to end on. Thanks to a great audience, and please join me in thanking our panelists.